December 16th, 1942. Ledo, Assam, India. Major General Louis A. Pick stood at the edge of the jungle, staring into what his own engineers called the most hostile terrain on Earth. Behind him stretched the rail terminus that marked the end of civilization. Before him lay 478 miles of mountains, rivers, and jungle so dense that aerial reconnaissance could barely penetrate the canopy. Somewhere beyond that green hell lay China, starving, fighting, and slowly dying because the Japanese had severed its last supply line. The Burma Road, China's umbilical cord to the outside world, had fallen to Japanese forces in April 1942. With it died China's ability to sustain resistance against the Japanese invasion that had already consumed half the country. Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek's armies, once numbering 4 million men, faced collapse. American Lend-Lease supplies piled up in Indian warehouses, while Chinese soldiers fought with bare hands and empty stomachs 300 miles away across impassable mountains. The Japanese believed they had achieved strategic checkmate. Field Marshal Count Hisaichi Terauchi, Supreme Commander of the Southern Army, reported to Tokyo that China's isolation was complete and permanent. His staff officers calculated that no power on Earth could construct a road through the terrain separating India from China. The monsoons alone, 9 months of torrential rain annually, would defeat any such attempt. The mountains, rising to 14,000 feet, created barriers that had stopped armies throughout history. The jungle, infested with disease, would kill workers faster than they could be replaced. What Terauchi didn't know was that standing at Ledo that December morning was an American general who had built levees against the Mississippi River, who had constructed highways through Louisiana swamps, who believed that American engineering could overcome any obstacle nature presented. Louis Pick had been given an impossible mission. He intended to accomplish it in 18 months. The strategic situation demanded miracles. By late 1942, China was approaching collapse. The Japanese had occupied every Chinese port, controlled every railway, and dominated the coastal waters. The only supply route remaining was the Hump, a treacherous air route over the Himalayas where C-46 and C-47 transport planes fought turbulence, ice, and altitude to deliver supplies. Between April and November 1942, the Hump delivered barely 6,000 tons monthly, less than 1/10 of China's minimum requirements. General Joseph Stilwell, commanding American forces in the China-Burma-India theater, understood the mathematics of survival. China needed 15,000 tons monthly just to maintain defensive positions. To launch offensive operations capable of tying down Japanese forces that might otherwise reinforce the Pacific, China required 50,000 tons monthly. The Hump, even if expanded dramatically, could never deliver such quantities. A land route was essential. The old Burma Road was gone, captured by Japanese forces who now controlled all of Burma. The only alternative was to build a new road from scratch through terrain no modern highway had ever crossed. The Ledo Road project began with surveys that revealed the magnitude of the challenge. The route would traverse the Patkai Range, mountains covered in jungle so thick that survey crews could advance only hundreds of yards daily. The Naga Hills beyond rose to peaks where temperatures dropped below freezing while valleys below sweltered at 110 degrees. 6 major rivers, including the Irrawaddy, Burma's main artery, would require bridges capable of supporting 20-ton trucks and tanks. Then came the monsoons. From May through October, rainfall exceeded 200 inches in some areas. The existing Ledo to Assam railway, built by the British over decades, required constant maintenance just to remain operational. Building all-weather highway through country that received more rain than any place on Earth except the slopes of Mount Waialaul in Hawaii seemed physically impossible. The Japanese weren't the only skeptics. British military authorities in India dismissed the project as American fantasy. Field Marshal Archibald Wavell, Commander-in-Chief India, stated bluntly that the road could not be built in less than 5 years, if at all. He recommended abandoning the scheme and accepting China's isolation as a strategic reality. Winston Churchill agreed, calling the Ledo Road the worst mistake of the war, a waste of resources that should be devoted to operations in Europe. General Pick ignored them all. On December 16, 1942, he ordered Lieutenant Colonel John Arrowsmith to take the 45th Engineer Regiment, a unit of African-American soldiers who had been training for construction duty in Liberia, and began pushing a road through the Patkai Range. The race against time, terrain, and the Japanese army had begun. The 45th Engineers moved into the jungle on December 20th, 1942, accompanied by a battalion of Chinese infantry for security. The regiment, composed of African-American enlisted men and both white and black officers, had been formed just 18 months earlier when the army, still segregated, expanded its engineer forces to meet wartime demands. Most of the men came from the rural south, familiar with hard labour but completely unprepared for what they would encounter in the jungles of Burma. The initial advance measured progress in yards per day. Dense bamboo, some stalks 6 inches in diameter, had to be cleared by hand. Mahogany and teak trees, massive hardwoods requiring hours to fell, blocked the route every few hundred feet. The jungle floor, invisible under the canopy, concealed ravines, streams, and obstacles that halted bulldozers repeatedly. When Lieutenant James Wilson of the 45th Company radioed that his platoon had advanced 300 yards in their first day, headquarters considered it excellent progress. The equipment itself proved inadequate initially. The bulldozers and graders sent from the United States were designed for highway construction in temperate climates. In the Patkai Mountains, where slopes exceeded 45 degrees and rain turned everything to mud, the machines slipped, stalled, and broke down repeatedly. Sergeant Robert Thompson wrote in a letter that survived in the National Archives that we lost more bulldozers to ravines in the first week than the Japanese destroyed in 6 months of combat. But American engineering adaptability began solving problems faster than the jungle created them. When standard bulldozers couldn't handle the slopes, maintenance crews welded additional steel plates to the blades for weight and fabricated counterweights for the rear. When tropical heat caused engines to overheat, mechanics installed auxiliary cooling systems improvised from spare parts. When monsoon rains threatened to halt all work, engineers developed drainage systems that kept the roadbed passable even during downpours. The real innovation came in road construction technique. Traditional highway engineering called for surveying the entire route, then constructing in coordinated sections. Pick abandoned this approach as too slow. Instead, he ordered simultaneous construction starting from multiple points along the projected route. Survey teams would advance just far enough ahead to keep construction crews moving. If the surveyors found an impassable obstacle, the route would be adjusted on the spot. Speed mattered more than optimization. By February 1943, 3 separate construction teams were pushing through the Patkai Range along roughly parallel routes. The 45th Engineers advanced along the northern route. The 823rd Engineer Aviation Battalion, another African-American unit, worked the southern approach. The 330th Engineer Regiment, a white unit from Ohio, tackled the central route through some of the most difficult terrain. Competition developed between units, each determined to advance faster than the others. This friendly rivalry would drive the entire project forward. The human cost began mounting immediately. Malaria struck within weeks of entering the jungle. By March 1943, the 45th Engineers reported that over 40% of their strength was hospitalized with malaria, dysentery, or dengue fever. The medical facilities at Ledo, overwhelmed by casualties, could barely handle the influx. Soldiers worked 6 days before fever forced them to sick call, returned to duty after minimal recovery, and collapsed again within days. General Pick responded with characteristic determination. He demanded that the Army Medical Corps establish aid stations every 10 miles along the road. He ordered the distribution of atabrine, the synthetic anti-malarial drug that American pharmaceutical companies were producing in increasing quantities. He mandated that every soldier take daily atabrine tablets, enforcing the requirement through spot checks and unit discipline. When some soldiers refused, claiming the yellow discoloration it caused was worse than malaria risk, Pick personally visited units to explain that dead soldiers built no roads. The disease control measures worked slowly but effectively. By June 1943, malaria rates had dropped to 15%, still devastating but manageable. The establishment of base camps with screened sleeping quarters, the draining of standing water near work sites, and the distribution of mosquito netting reduced disease transmission. But the jungle's biological assault continued relentlessly. Leeches infested every stream crossing. Poisonous snakes, including cobras and kraits, killed workers regularly. Skin diseases from constant wetness hospitalized hundreds. March 1943 brought the first Japanese interference. Until then, Japanese forces had ignored the road construction, apparently convinced it would fail on its own. But as the advance continued despite all obstacles, Japanese commanders recognized the threat. If the Americans actually succeeded in building a road to China, the entire Japanese position in Burma would be compromised. A regiment from the 18th Division, veterans of the Burma campaign, moved north to interdict the construction. The first attack came on March 28th against a forward camp of the 45th Engineers. Japanese infantry infiltrated during darkness and opened fire at dawn from positions surrounding the camp. The engineers, combat-trained but inexperienced, initially panicked before their officers rallied them. Corporal James Davis, commanding a machine gun squad, held his position for 4 hours against repeated attacks, earning the first Silver Star awarded to the Ledo Road project. The Japanese withdrew after failing to overrun the camp, but they had demonstrated that the engineers would be fighting while they built. General Pick's response transformed the project's character. He demanded infantry support from Stilwell, receiving the Chinese 38th Division commanded by General Sun Li-jen, a Virginia Military Institute graduate who had trained with American methods. He ordered that all engineer units receive combat training equivalent to infantry. He established defensive perimeters around every work site and mandated that 1/3 of each unit would maintain security while the others worked. The Ledo Road would be built by soldiers who fought and engineers who soldiered simultaneously. The Japanese attacks continued but failed to stop progress. On April 14th, a Japanese company ambushed a convoy near the 40-mile marker, destroying 3 trucks and killing 7 Americans before Chinese infantry counterattacked and drove them off. On May 3rd, Japanese mortars targeted a bridge construction site, forcing the engineers to work at night to avoid observation. On May 20th, a 2-day battle erupted when Japanese forces tried to destroy a newly completed section of road, failing when American artillery, laboriously brought forward, drove them back. By June 1943, the road had advanced 61 miles from Ledo, an achievement that silenced some skeptics. But the Patkai Range, the first obstacle, remained unconquered. The mountains ahead rose to peaks where construction would require cutting through solid rock. The Taurong River, encountered at the 70-mile point, demanded a bridge that would take 3 months to complete, and the monsoons, the ultimate test, were beginning. The 1943 monsoon season arrived in late May with rains that exceeded even pessimistic predictions. In June alone, some sections of the road received over 100 inches of rainfall. The dirt roadway, even with drainage systems, turned to soup. Bulldozers sank to their chassis. Trucks required winching through stretches where the mud exceeded 3 feet deep. Landslides buried completed sections, requiring them to be rebuilt entirely. The engineering response demonstrated the project's evolving sophistication. Pick ordered the construction of a gravel processing plant at Ledo that could produce 500 cubic yards daily. Trucks hauled this gravel forward to create a stable roadbed even during the worst downpours. When gravel supplies couldn't keep pace with construction, engineers quarried stone from mountains along the route, crushing it on site with portable equipment. When even this proved insufficient, they learned to build corduroy roads, logs laid perpendicular to the route providing temporary stability until better materials arrived. The monsoon also brought unexpected opportunities. The torrential rains that made construction difficult also grounded Japanese aircraft and hindered their ground operations. With air reconnaissance impossible and movement through the jungle severely restricted, Japanese forces couldn't effectively monitor the road's progress or coordinate attacks. The Americans worked through conditions that would have halted operations in any conventional campaign, maintaining momentum through sheer determination. By October 1943, when the monsoons finally ended, the road had reached the 103-mile marker at Xingbuyang. This advance, accomplished despite disease, combat, and weather that tested the limits of human endurance, proved the project's feasibility. What had been dismissed as impossible had become merely extremely difficult. The engineers had conquered the Patkai Range. Ahead lay the Hukong Valley, and beyond it the real test, the route through Japanese-held Burma to the old Burma Road. the strategic situation was shifting in ways that made the Ledo Road increasingly critical. In the Pacific, American forces had begun their island-hopping campaign, but progress remained slow and costly. In Europe, the invasion of France loomed on the horizon, but success required preventing German forces from reinforcing from other theatres. China, tying down over 1 million Japanese soldiers who might otherwise be deployed elsewhere, was approaching the point where either massive resupply would enable offensive operations, or collapse would free those Japanese forces for use against American advances. General Stilwell, always contentious and difficult, recognized that the Ledo Road represented more than logistics. It was psychological warfare against both the Japanese, who proclaimed China's isolation permanent, and the Chinese, who were losing faith in American commitment. Every mile of road built declared that America would not abandon its ally. Every bridge completed demonstrated that American engineering could overcome obstacles the Japanese believed insurmountable. The expansion of the project in late 1943 reflected its growing priority. The 209th, 236th, and 382nd Engineer Regiments arrived from the United States, bringing the total engineer force to over 15,000 men. The 1,883rd Engineer Aviation Battalion, specialists in airfield construction, began building staging fields along the route to support supply operations. The 823rd and 849th Engineer Aviation Battalions joined the effort, their heavy equipment expertise proving invaluable in the mountains. The demographic composition of this engineering army reflected America's segregated military. Of the approximately 15,000 engineers working on the Ledo Road by early 1944, over 60% were African American soldiers serving in segregated units. These men, denied combat roles by Army policy that assumed their unsuitability for fighting, were proving that they could build under fire and fight while building. The irony was lost on no one. America was asking black soldiers to build a road to freedom for China while denying them full equality at home. The combat intensified as construction entered the Hukaung Valley in January 1944. The Japanese 18th Division, realizing that the road threatened their entire position in northern Burma, committed major forces to stopping it. The battles that followed demonstrated that the Ledo Road had become a genuine military operation, not merely a construction project with occasional skirmishes. The Battle of Xingbuyang, fought between January 28th and February 3rd, 1944, saw Chinese forces supported by American artillery and air power defend the forward supply base, while engineers continued working just miles away. Japanese attacks came at night, exploiting their infiltration skills, but American illumination rounds and concentrated machine gun fire broke up the assaults. When the Japanese withdrew after losing over 300 men, they left behind evidence that they had intended to destroy the entire base and drive the road builders back to India. Pick's response was to accelerate construction. Rather than pausing to consolidate, he ordered the engineers forward immediately. If the Japanese wanted to fight for every mile, the Americans would advance so quickly that Japanese reinforcements couldn't keep pace. The strategy worked. By March 1944, the road had reached Xingbuyang at the entrance to the Hukaung Valley, 147 miles from Ledo. The pace, averaging nearly a mile per day despite combat and terrain, stunned observers. The engineering challenges in the Hukaung Valley exceeded anything encountered in the Patkai Range. The valley, 20 miles wide and 60 miles long, appeared flat from the air but concealed hundreds of streams that had to be bridged. The soil, saturated by water tables just inches below the surface, couldn't support heavy equipment without extensive preparation. The local population, Kachin tribesmen who had suffered under Japanese occupation, provided guides and intelligence but warned that the valley flooded completely during monsoons. The solution required innovations that would influence military engineering for decades. Engineers developed a technique of laying bamboo mats beneath the roadbed, creating a foundation that distributed weight and prevented sinking. When bamboo supplies proved insufficient, they fabricated steel mesh from salvaged materials, creating the first expedient matting that would later be standardized as pier steel planking. When stream crossings became too numerous for conventional bridges, they designed prefabricated Bailey bridges that could be assembled in hours rather than days. April 1944 brought the project's most significant milestone. On April 27th, bulldozers of the 45th Engineers met advance elements of Chinese forces pushing south from the old Burma Road near Mongyu. The physical connection had been established. After 16 months of continuous construction through some of Earth's most hostile terrain, American engineers and Chinese soldiers stood on ground that linked India to China. The Japanese stranglehold had been broken. But completing the connection was different from opening the road. The route, while passable for tracked vehicles and trucks moving slowly, required extensive improvement before it could handle the tonnage China needed. Bridges remained temporary structures requiring replacement. The roadbed, adequate for light traffic, would disintegrate under sustained heavy use. Fuel and supply depots had to be established at intervals along the entire route. The road existed, but transforming it into a functioning supply line required 6 more months of intensive work. The strategic implications were already clear. Intelligence intercepts revealed Japanese consternation at the road's completion. The Southern Army headquarters in Rangoon reported to Tokyo that the impossible had occurred, that American engineering had accomplished what Japanese planners had calculated could not be done. Field Marshal Terauchi, who had assured Tokyo that China's isolation was permanent, was relieved of command. The road's existence, even before it carried significant tonnage, had achieved a psychological victory. General Stilwell, never one for understatement, declared the road his personal vindication. He had fought bureaucratic battles with both American and British authorities who wanted to abandon the project. He had defended it against critics who claimed the resources would be better spent elsewhere. Now his judgment stood confirmed. The road existed because he had insisted it would exist. In typical Stilwell fashion, he immediately demanded that construction continue to improve and expand the route while supplies began flowing. The monsoon season of 1944 tested the completed sections as severely as it had tested the builders. June through September brought rainfall that turned the road into a river in places. Maintenance crews worked continuously, repairing washouts, rebuilding collapsed culverts, and fighting the jungle's constant attempt to reclaim what had been taken from it. The fact that traffic continued despite the monsoons, that trucks and equipment kept moving even through the worst weather, proved that the road had been built to standards exceeding those of conventional highways. The tonnage figures told the story of success. In August 1944, the first convoy of 100 trucks departed Ledo for Kunming's China, carrying supplies that would have required 20 C-46 flights over the hump. By October, the road was handling 1,000 tons weekly. By December, as additional improvements were completed, tonnage reached 3,000 tons weekly. By January 1945, the Ledo Road was delivering more supplies monthly than the hump airlift had managed in its entire first year of operation. The human cost had been staggering. The official casualty figures, compiled after the war, recorded that 1,133 Americans died building the Ledo Road. Another 4,000 were evacuated with injuries or diseases that ended their military service. Approximately 33,000 cases of malaria were treated, with many soldiers contracting the disease multiple times. These numbers, stark and terrible, represented losses that would have broken conventional construction projects. They demonstrated the price of accomplishing the impossible. The African American engineers who comprised the majority of the workforce received recognition that was unprecedented for segregated units. The 45th Engineers, first into the jungle and last out, received the Meritorious Unit Commendation, the first time this award had been given to a segregated unit. Individual decorations, including silver stars, bronze stars, and purple hearts, were awarded without the racial discrimination that plagued other aspects of military service. The commanding officers, many of whom had never worked with black soldiers before the war, almost universally praised the performance, discipline, and courage of their men. Lieutenant Colonel John Arrowsmith, who had led the 45th Engineers from the first day, wrote in his after-action report that no group of soldiers in any theatre of war had accomplished more under worse conditions than the men who built the road. He recommended that the 45th be converted to a combat engineer regiment and assigned to the invasion of Japan, a recommendation that would have been unthinkable earlier in the war. The road had changed more than geography. It had begun changing attitudes. By March 1945, the Ledo Road, now officially renamed the Stilwell Road in honor of the general who had willed it into existence, was handling 6,000 tons weekly. Convoys departed Ledo daily, travelling the 478 miles to Kunming in 5 days, a journey that had been impossible 18 months earlier. Chinese armies, receiving artillery, ammunition, and supplies in quantities they had never known, launched offensives that recaptured territory and tied down Japanese forces desperately needed elsewhere. The Japanese, facing catastrophic defeats throughout their empire, acknowledged that the road had been a decisive factor in their Burma campaign's collapse. Documents captured after Japan's surrender revealed that Japanese planners had considered the road's construction the turning point in the Burma theatre. They had calculated correctly that building such a road was nearly impossible. They had miscalculated American determination to attempt the nearly impossible and succeed. The final statistics of the Ledo Road project documented an engineering achievement that ranks among the greatest in military history. 478 miles of all-weather highway built through terrain that had never seen a road. 155 bridges constructed, including 10 major spans over rivers exceeding 500 feet in width. 8,000 culverts installed to handle drainage during monsoons. 355 miles of telephone lines strung, providing communication throughout the route. 60 supply depots established, creating an infrastructure that could support sustained operations. The cost in resources matched the human toll. The project consumed over $15 million monthly at its peak, equivalent to over $200 million in today's currency. It required 13,000 pieces of heavy equipment, from bulldozers to graders to cranes, many of which were destroyed and replaced multiple times. It used 15 million gallons of fuel, hauled from India at tremendous expense. It employed not just American engineers but also British supervisors, Indian labourers, Chinese soldiers, and Kachin guides, a multinational effort that reflected the global nature of the war. General Lewis Pick, promoted to Major General during construction and eventually rising to Chief of Engineers of the United States Army, always maintained that the Ledo Road represented American engineering at its finest. In his post-war writings, he emphasized that the road succeeded because American soldiers refused to accept defeat. British doubters had calculated that construction was impossible. Japanese opponents had fought to prevent completion. Nature itself had marshaled every obstacle terrain, weather, and disease could provide. But American determination, backed by industrial capacity and engineering skill, had overcome all obstacles. The Chinese, liberated from isolation by the road, never forgot. Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, whatever his other failures, understood that the Ledo Road represented America's commitment to China at a moment when abandonment seemed possible. In ceremonies marking the road's opening, he declared it the bridge between two great republics, a symbol that America would not leave China to face Japan alone. For Chinese soldiers who had fought for years with inadequate supplies, the first convoys arriving from India represented hope that survival was possible and victory achievable. The legacy of the Ledo Road extends beyond its immediate military significance. The construction techniques developed in the Burmese jungle, from expedient matting to prefabricated bridges to rapid drainage systems, became standard practices in military engineering. The lessons learned about building under fire, about maintaining momentum despite casualties, about refusing to let obstacles prevent mission accomplishment, shaped American engineering doctrine for generations. The road also contributed to civil rights progress in ways that weren't immediately apparent. African American soldiers who built the road under conditions that would have broken many units returned home, having proved their capabilities beyond argument. The officers who commanded them, many of whom had absorbed the prejudices of their time, returned having learned that courage, skill, and dedication transcended race. These changes in attitude, multiplied across thousands of men, contributed to the post-war civil rights movement that would finally dismantle legal segregation. Today, portions of the Ledo Road still exist, now called the Stilwell Road in India and the Burma Road extension in Myanmar. The jungle has reclaimed much of it. The monsoons have eroded sections, and the bridges have long since collapsed. But satellite imagery can still trace the route, a scar across the landscape that testifies to what American engineers accomplished between 1942 and 1945. Occasionally, hikers encounter concrete markers placed by the engineers, bearing unit insignia and dates, silent monuments to men who died building a road through hell. The Japanese miscalculation about American engineering capability represented a strategic error as significant as their miscalculation about American will to fight. They had assumed that the soft, undisciplined Americans would never endure the hardships required to build through such terrain. They had believed that racial divisions would prevent the kind of unified effort the project demanded. They had calculated that disease and casualties would break American determination long before the road could be completed. Every assumption proved wrong. The Americans, far from being soft, demonstrated that free men fighting for a cause could endure hardships that broke armies fighting from compulsion. The racial divisions, while real and damaging, didn't prevent African American soldiers from accomplishing extraordinary feats. The disease and casualties, terrible as they were accepted as the price of mission accomplishment, rather than reasons for mission abandonment. Field Marshal Terauchi had told Tokyo that China's isolation was permanent. General Louis Pick, standing in the jungle at Ledo in December 1942, had believed otherwise. 16 months later, American trucks rolled into China carrying supplies that would help defeat Japan. The impossible had been accomplished. The secret American project that reopened China's Lifeline stands as testimony to engineering determination, soldiers' courage, and the American capacity to achieve the impossible when survival demands it. The Ledo Road was built because failure was not an option, and because American engineers refused to accept the verdict of experts who said it couldn't be done.